All right. Wendy, when was the last time that you cried?
Well, that's a very personal question because I don't cry very often,
I don't either. I don't either.
but I wept uncontrollably actually, watching the series Little Bird, by Jennifer Podemski. If you're watching YouTube, that's the J up there. She's coming up. It's on Crave, her whole series. You can see it now. It's the very first original drama series that's been done by Crave. It's the first, more importantly, it's the first real series about the 60s Scoop, which is basically Indigenous kids taken from their families, not just in the 60s, but in the 70s and 80s. And anyway, thousands of kids taken from Indigenous families, given to adopting families. And I cried, and not just because I'm a big suck, but also
But that too.
that too. But I'm a mom, and in this tale,
Yeah.
not only is there like a massive wrong, there are two moms and two
Yeah.
families
Yeah.
torn apart. So it's quite compelling.
There's a lot to cry about. And it's a really moving story. It's beautifully told. It's not a documentary, although it could be. It's a dramatization. I'm 4 episodes in, and John and I have been watching it religiously. And you know what? He cries at the drop of
Aw.
a hat. And I love that about him. And I try not to drop hats because it gets messy. But to my shame, I did not know anything about the 60s Scoop. I knew about residential schools, but I never really, like so many people, I never really thought, how did those kids get there? What happened? How were they taken?
Yeah.
And Little Bird addresses that.
Yeah, it's quite something that it's a great tale, not just that people need to learn what happened, but it's an amazing story. But it made me think of the podcast, the interview, the chat that we had with Cindy Blackstock. So she's an activist. She's fought a lot for Indigenous kids. And she said that she was always shocked by how many Canadians thought that when she was growing up, she thought so many Canadians think they're great, that they're doing the right thing, but they actually don't know squat. Uh, yeah. So
Yeah,
Jennifer
literally
Podemski,
the road to hell is paved with good intentions because, at best, the white people at the time were thinking that they were saving these
yeah.
Indigenous kids.
Yeah, well, I'm sure Jennifer Podemski, who's going to be on our podcast, she's got a lot of thoughts on that. She's the executive producer of Little Bird. She's half Jewish, half Indigenous, and which is sort of
That's cool.
belongs with the story. You might know her as an actor. She was in Dance Me Outside. That was her first big break. She's appeared on Degrassi. She made the movie Empire of Dirt, which was nominated for a bazillion awards, won a couple. But she became a producer mostly because she wanted to tell Indigenous stories, and she thought that Indigenous people should be telling those stories.
What a crazy idea. Actually, almost the entire production crew behind Little Bird is made up of, well, mostly women, and many of them are of mixed heritage themselves. But the story, I think, anyone can relate to it. I have a friend who recently met her. She was adopted. She met her family. Mixed results about that. Be careful what you wish for. But yeah, it's what we're trying to tell you is watch Little Bird and then join us for this conversation.
So Jennifer Podemski is going to join us now. I hope. We had a couple technical issues, but there you are. Hi, Jennifer.
There you are.
Actor, producer. Yeah. Oh, it's wonderful to see you. Wonderful.
Writer.
Wonderful.
And we're not just blowing sunshine. We both just so moved by this amazing, I was going to say wonderful story, but it's heartbreaking. And I think you're getting universally the same reaction that people are like, wow.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you for that. I'm so glad it's over. First of all, it's a very long journey. And I'm really, I'm recovering from telling that story. And so it's good to be talking about it in retrospect. And of course, with such a great group of people on a great podcast. So I'm excited to tell you all the things you want to know about how
it must have been so painful to tell that story because I didn't like as I was saying to Maureen, it's it's a great story for people to learn about, but it's also just an amazing story, and why it was never told. I don't know, like, and it is something that I think that everyone can relate to, because like, one of the most it sounds so stupid in comparison, but I was so torn when I took Kate, who was 5, who was the age of the little girl in the story, who was basically torn from her parents. um Everybody screaming. I was screaming when I took Kate to kindergarten, and the kindergarten teacher stole her out of my arms, and it was so traumatic. It's so stupid.
But you got her back.
I got her back like an hour later. Like in your story, or in many of the stories of the 60s Scoop, the kids never see their parents again. The mums, the dads never see their kids again. It's just
What, Jen, let's go back to why this happened. All right. Why? I mean, it's like I said, we know about the residential schools, but what was the thinking behind removing all these children from their families?
So basically, in short, what happened was residential schools had a 100-year legacy, and by the 60s, 50s, 60s, I guess the management of the removal of Indigenous kids from families transferred from the federal kind of pocket to the provinces. And that became a part of the greater child welfare system. And at that time, the motivation, specifically in Saskatchewan, probably because of the very densely populated, reserves and, communities and cities of Indigenous people, there was a program called Adopt an Indian Métis, which was a provincially funded program that was designed to kind of expedite the removal and either adoption and sometimes sale of Indigenous kids into the general public, ideally with non-Indigenous families, as an effort to do the same thing that residential school was doing, which was to remove the Indian from the child and to absorb those children and absolve them of all their culture and identity and absorb them into the body politic of Canada. And oftentimes in Europe and in the States, they went all over the world for that goal of, essentially removing the Indian problem, which is, what was originally stated in the Constitution, when John A. Macdonald ended up signing it and saying we have an Indian problem and this is how we're going to deal with it. So it sort of filtered through a bunch of different incarnations, and the 60s Scoop was kind of the version that we saw during the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And today we actually call it the Millennial Scoop, because there are more children in care today, Indigenous children in care today, than there were in all of residential school or the 60s Scoop.
That is stunning in the negative sense. That alone, I mean, have we not evolved? Have we not learned anything? Do we not have any respect? That is really shocking. The kids were living on the family when they were all together in Saskatchewan, were living on the reservation. They didn't have running water and they didn't have electricity. They were off grid. And that was the reasoning used by the powers that be to remove the kids, that they were being brought up with no regard to family relationships. Just like, this is the reason you can't raise kids like this. But this is an ongoing problem. There's still reservations where they don't have clean water.
Yeah. They
don't have electricity. And, as a result, ongoing drug abuse and so on. From what you've been through, and you've been through a lot, how do we change course?
Well, that is probably a question, that we cannot leave this podcast today with an answer.
Didn't think so.
Sorry.
Damn.
But, I think it is really people like Cindy Blackstock you were mentioning at the beginning, people who are really on the front lines of dismantling the kind of systemic, and structural racism that does exist, to create spaces where Indigenous people can create policies that are designed really to rebuild community and address some of those issues that are a direct result of the removal of children and dismantling of families. And until we can do that, and we do see results today that are, that shows that the needle has moved in the right direction in favor of Indigenous people and communities. But I think it's so minimal, and a lot of work has to be done. I mean, for me, it's just storytelling. I think that we have a lot of reparations to take on, and doing that through storytelling is, really the only way I know how to do it. So
it was so fascinating because we've interviewed a couple of people, white people, who grew up with, no running water, and they did fine. Their kids were not taken away from them. So, I think that there are lots of reasons, and now you've got Crave, you've done a series, you've got the Shine Network, which is a digital component for getting these stories out, and things are changing. And I'm wondering, like, for you, just how different are things? Like you talk now about when you began, you were the only Indigenous person who was basically offered racist stereotype roles, and you decided, no, we got to change this. And now you're calling people, and everybody's busy. So I mean, things are changing.
Yeah, I definitely see the change. I can see just within the community that I'm in. There's a lot of us working on our own stuff, which is great. But on the other side, I think there is still kind of a dearth of Indigenous stories. And I kind of use the metric of like how Canadians respond to, let's say, missing and murdered Indigenous women as an epidemic and as a crisis. That there's really not a lot being said by Canadians. And I think that is a direct result of the way the narrative has kind of cemented this idea that we are not, that we are less than human, right? Across time, I think that narrative still exists. So it is changing, and I think there is a little bit of more hope maybe than I had even last year, but there's a lot of work to do. And I think a lot of it has to do with, changing that narrative. And that narrative is more of like a social narrative, where when things happen to people, most people stand up and pay attention and, stand in solidarity with groups that bad things are happening to. But that so rarely happens with Indigenous people, because I think, our absence in the education system, our absence in the political system is just an example of like us being invisible, kind of by design. So there's a lot of work to do. But to not be such a downer, I think that it's such a good time. We are in such a good time for people to work together, like creating partnerships that are Indigenous led, to enhance, visibility and equity and all of those things that feel so good when a society is able to do them properly. I think that today we definitely feel like that we've had a big shakedown with, since COVID, and just things feel kind of, I think everyone feels a little bit destabilized for one reason or another. And this is a good time, if we're going to restabilize, to do it in a more, focused, united way, with where the people who have can support those who don't have, and the people who can offer space can, offer that space to people who don't have any space.
Jen, let's go back. So you're half Jewish and half Ojibwa, and let's go back to, and that's the case with your protagonist, with Esther, or Bezhig, is her indigenous name. I was really interested in the scenes that took place in Montreal with Esther's Jewish family, her engagement party. And I mean, I grew up in Montreal. I was the only non-Jewish kid in a theater school, and I was the only non-French kid in a French school. So, I know a little bit about not being neither fish nor fowl, right? Not quite fitting into both. I desperately wanted to be Jewish because all my Jewish friends had the best family life and would invite me back, and the food was great, and so on. So I grew up with that. But I was thinking, so what was your experience like? Did you feel comfortable in both worlds, or is there one that you feel is more you, for lack of a better way of asking?
Well, first, I just want to clarify, Little Bird is not my story. So that is a completely fictionalized
But
story.
You have the same background.
But I am Jewish. Like my
Yes.
dad is Israeli Jewish. My grandfather is a Holocaust survivor. My mother is from Muscopetang First Nation in Saskatchewan, whereas Esther is fully Indigenous from a community in Saskatchewan and raised in a Jewish family. So in terms of, the identity, the complexity of her identity, I did use so much of my own experience being stuck between those two worlds. However, for me, it was always just not fitting into anywhere, mostly because of the way that I looked. I'm clearly not white or Jewish looking, and I'm not fully Native looking. So I was just always sort of questioned about who I was and like, why do I look like this? And that kind of in childhood makes you feel, not a part of things. So without the racism, most of the racism I experienced was really like as an Asian person. I definitely received a lot of anti-Asian kind of racism growing up. But I think because my mom was so far away from her family, and we lived in a very Jewish area in Toronto, in North York, and my dad's family was very consistently there. We had Shabbat dinner every Friday night. We were with his family, with my grandparents and my aunt all the time. Whereas my mom's family lived in Saskatchewan and British Columbia. So until we moved out west, we didn't really spend a lot of time with her family. So she was very isolated. And I know how difficult that was for her and how lonely that was for her. And so much of Esther was inspired by my mother and me witnessing her alienation growing up, and also my own sense of inner conflict about, where I belonged. So all of those things are really what I was able to bring to Esther's character. And then of course we had real lived experiences of 60 Scoop survivors who helped us to build the PTSD and, the story of being taken from your family and how that sort of plays out. I think, at 50, I can say I don't feel like I'm half of anything. I'm just fully who I am. And that is, a long history of Anishinaabe people and a long mix of, Cree and Métis and Lenape and, however far it goes back on my mom's side. And then on my dad's side, the Polish and Russian legacy that was completely on my grandfather's side gone, except for one brother. So I have a bunch of family in Israel. So my family is all over, and I feel very much connected to both of my histories that I come from. And it works for me as a storyteller. I think that was probably why I'm here, is to somehow become a bridge between divided communities and divided people. And, in that way, I think storytelling is a very powerful connector of human beings and human experiences.
That's what I was really struck by that by the end of the series, that there is so much love for both families, even though her real family is the indigenous family that she was stolen from. She was raised by a Jewish family, but there is a very telling moment in it when she says to her Jewish mother, but it was wrong. And the mother is saying, no, 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 we were saving you from a life of poverty. We were saving you, which is what so many ignorant or white or well-meaning, or however you want to, name them, people thought, but it was wrong. So is that changing now?
Well, that's going back to what we were talking off the top again about the road to hell being, yeah, people still think that Aboriginal kids grew up in the worst possible circumstances. And that's not necessarily untrue, but it's also not necessarily true.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that, there are extraordinary and disproportionate realities that Indigenous families are facing today. And a lot of it has to do with poverty, and a lot of it has to do with, even if you're 20 minutes from Toronto on a reserve, you may have no clean water, no access to clean water, which is, something that every human being should have. You would think that should come to people so easily, but that is one thing I think that is indicative of how communities on reserve are being, are being treated through policy. So there are those extraordinary circumstances, but I think what we were really aiming to do was to show one very specific story, because there are obviously tens of thousands of stories. Each one, feels worse than the other, and it's hard to know which one was going to work most effectively on television, because some are just unbelievable. Like, it's too unbelievable for television.
Yeah, well, reading that there were ads that, and you said that some kids were even sold.
Yeah,
it's just.
Yeah. So we heard several stories of kids being sold as labor
Wow.
to farmers. A lot in the States, kids who were trafficked to the States. And yeah, the ads were part of that Adopt an Indian Métis program. So there were catalogs made, kind of telling.
So you could pick one.
Yeah.
You could say, I'll have one of these and one of those, like their eggs.
Yeah.
Wow.
Exactly.
I wanted to sidetrack a little bit more back to you. So you and your sisters are all performers, are all actors, correct?
Yeah.
She's sort of that's interesting.
Yeah.
I love this story, and it is we're talking very seriously about serious matters, but you have said that you wanted to be a clown.
Yeah.
And that they obviously like making people laugh or scaring them. I don't know. It could be both. But tell us about your first experience when you went to New York and, being who you are and looking like you do, which is, we pointed out, or you pointed out, people were giving you a hard time for looking Asian. Tell us what happened to you when you decided that you would present yourself to various casting agents.
In New York.
Well, there was LA first, I think, right? And then you went to William Morris and.
Yeah. That was kind of early in my 20s. After I had done Dance Me Outside, I was living, I guess with someone who was working a lot in the industry and very successful. And she kind of inspired me to check out LA. So I went to stay with a friend there, and, went to William Morris for an interview. And it was very weird. Like, definitely, I think for every actor, and woman for sure, it's always like, stand up, turn around, let me see your body, let me see what you look like. your jacket, like that kind of stuff. But it's like, I don't really know what I would do with you. Like, I don't know what you, like, I can't tell what you are. Like, a lot of people, especially casting directors at the time, were like, you're just too, you're not really native enough to play native. So I would often lose those roles to non-native people who were,
Look
Asian.
more native.
Yeah, who look more native. And you're not really white, so I really have no idea what to do with you. So it was a lot of that kind of stuff. And that just kind of continued. Although I'm really lucky. I did get to do a lot of great work. I did Diviners with Sonia Smits and Tom Jackson, Conspiracy of Silence, Dance Me Outside, and then The Rez, and then Degrassi. So I definitely would consider myself incredibly blessed that I was able to do those things. And despite that, I just was never able to make a living as an actor because it was so few and far between. And then this whole idea of how I looked and the things I would have to compromise and the kind of work that was coming my way, it was constantly like dehumanizing characters that I just couldn't handle. And sometimes I would do them because I was aware that if I didn't do it, it's possible that it would go to someone non-Indigenous. And then at least if it's me, I could be on set and like somehow educate people. And then I just felt like this is not really what I really wanted to be. A clown. I wanted to be in the circus. Like I wanted to. And that was actually right before I moved to New York. I did a movie called Bogus, and I got to train with the Cirque du Soleil. I got to train with Franco Dragone, the original like artistic director of Cirque. And I got to be a clown, and it was one of the best experiences of my life. And they invited me to do a shortlist audition for a clown in the Cirque du Soleil. And then I had a skiing accident and I couldn't walk for like a year. So it was like,
wow.
Time was like, what am I meant for? And that's when sort of shortly after that, I moved to New York because my sister was in Rent. So I went and stayed on her couch and thought maybe I'll try New York and see how that goes. And that didn't really work out.
Are you going to do like a series, like a clown Indigenous, where you teach everybody about
Jewish? Don't forget, like
Jewish.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there are people way more qualified, to do that than I am. But if someone approached me with a clown series and begged me to do it, I may not turn it down.
So what do you
That'd be
do
very
now?
cool to
Like
see.
what? So you've done your series, and we hope that everyone watches it because it's beautiful. I mean, it's regardless
beautiful.
of the meaning. It's
Only 6 episodes. You wish there were more, but the story is told in 6, and it's anyway. Go on, sorry, Wendy.
Yeah. So now what? Now what? I know you've got the Shine Network, which is the promoting Indigenous people to come out and tell stories digitally. But other than that, what do you do? Like, I don't know if this is a secret pleasures question or what.
I mostly work. I have a slate of projects that I've been developing. So I have projects that are kind of like in production. Some are corporate clients. Some are. There's a lot going on that is not like in production, let's say.
So are you always working? Like, what do you do for inspiration, or is it always working? Like I've been watching The Bear and I do not cook, but it's just the food is like so amazing. Is there something that you watch or is everything work related?
Yeah.
I typically don't watch content for inspiration. My inspiration comes from people. And I think that for me, the most important thing in life is gathering with people. And I'm big on hosting. Like I love to host people and I love to bring people together. So any chance I get to do that, that's what I do.
Do people go to Barrie? Because don't you live in Barrie?
Yeah.
Barrie's beautiful, man. I drive
right.
through it twice a week.
Yeah. A lot of people come to me, because I have, I guess, because I live in Barrie, I have a bigger house and I have, nature, and it's just, yeah, I just like hosting. So that is really my inspiration. And I write a lot. So, and I guess, the truth is that we are not, my family is very, we are an Indigenous family that faces a lot of those issues that you read in the newspaper. So that also inspires me, as tragic and devastating as it can be, having people in your family that have gone missing, or people in your family that are dealing with, those disproportionate realities that we see in the news. Those things inspire me to keep doing the work, whether it's through the Shine Network, where we're, training and advocating and creating opportunities and professional development resources. So putting tons of energy into that, or creating content that uplifts Indigenous stories or sheds light on Indigenous stories and experiences.
Yeah, because your whole series, The Little Bird, was the consultant on it was Nakusat, who runs the Native Women's Shelter in Montreal, which is kind of a big deal. My daughter's in Montreal and contributed to that and everything. And she tells the story about how she sees so many people from the equivalent, or actually from the 60s Scoop, because they've ended up screwed up, because that's what happens when you're removed from your family and you feel
the trauma. Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So I'm
some
go
ways
ahead.
that kind of drives you, it's sometimes inspiration comes from things that make you sad and you want to see, over, you want to see them stop happening.
Well, I hope they all become clowns. We're going to wrap soon, but yeah, I would like to be a clown. I was going to run away and join the circus too, but it's too hard, and too many people.
Very hard. So
the bearded
unpredictable.
ladies thing is over, but thank goodness.
I just find it so ironic that you broke your leg when you were hoping to be with Cirque du Soleil. I mean, you have to do more than walk to be in that, but you couldn't even do that. But you know what? It pointed you in probably a better direction.
Yeah, it really did. It's one of those sliding doors kinds of things. And
yeah.
Well,
life is long. Who knows what's next?
And you live in Barrie, so do you still ski, or is that over now?
No,
Oh dear.
That was
there are no ski hills in Barrie. I mean, I know they Mount St. Louis, Horseshoe.
Says the Montrealer, yes.
Please.
Well, Jennifer, it's been lovely to talk to you.
Thank you so much for having me.
And we will continue to sing the praises of the series because it's so good, and we look forward to whatever you do next.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, good luck with everything. And let us know when the clown series comes, because that would be fun too. Yeah.
Okay. I will. Don't hold your breath.
It says family behind your head. So yeah. So that's also what the story, The Little Bird, is about. It's about family. So yeah, very, very cool. Thank you so much, Jennifer. Jen.
There was one thing I was going to bring up with the Jen Podemski, and I'm glad I didn't, but I'll bring it up with you. I was watching the show, and I still have 2 more episodes to go, and like we said, really enjoying it. And but I felt this tremendous sense of guilt and shame, because the white people, almost without exception, they weren't so much like villainous; they were just so stupid and so self-absorbed, and so to a man or to a woman. And the reason why I didn't bring it up with Jen was like, you know what? I don't need you to help me deal with my white lady guilt. That's why I didn't want to talk to her about it. But did you not get that feeling? At one point, I turned to John going, God, is there anybody there that realizes this is wrong?
Well, I think, and this is maybe white lady guilt, and I think there's a lot of it, and I think it's good that she's done the series and that we're all a little bit more aware of the 60s Scoop because of her work. But I was really struck by her saying, and maybe it's because it's been sort of in the back of my head, is that we're all just people. They're just humans. like Indigenous people are they're just humans like everybody else. Like,
Yeah.
and so there have been hardships and they've been torn away from their family, but we're all just human, and let everybody be treated as a freaking human being.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know. I guess I wanted to ask, or I have been thinking about and wasn't sure I should ask the same thing. About Jean Chrétien, he was prime minister, and he had, I don't think it was 60s Scoop, but it was during the 70s, and it was a family from the Northwest Territories, so it's the equivalent of the 60s Scoop. He adopted an Inuit kid, and that kid ended up screwed up and ended up in the penal system and whatever, and had addiction issues. And Chrétien is quoted as saying, well, I didn't know anything bad. I didn't know that
Yeah.
there were all of these issues.
Well, I wonder what the circumstances were too, of where that boy came from.
Yeah, he came
was he
from an
taken?
orphanage.
Was he torn? Or he came from
Who
an
knows?
orphanage or a residential school, or was he torn from his family the way that the little girl in Little Bird was done? Well, we don't know, and
Yeah,
that
but it's
and
just this whole
ignorance
idea of,
is not acceptable. It
It's
just isn't.
not.
So,
yeah.
well, from one white lady to the other. So we're gonna have to deal with the guilt.
Yeah.
All right.
Lovely to see you. And,
Lovely to see you.
Yeah, and to see Jen. And I'm so glad that it worked out. So wonderful.